Hello, I'm Joseph White, Director of Workplace Futures and Insight for Herman Miller, coming to you today from the corner office setup of my apartment here in Brooklyn, New York. Design Milk has asked me to share a few thoughts with you about how design has responded to societal changes over time so that we can learn from those dynamics of change to help inform how we expect design to change in the future. Part of my role and part of this discussion here right now is this idea of future studies or scenario planning. One thing that I do want to say about that is this is not about predicting the future. It's about imagining the type of future that we want to build, looking for signals of change, and seeking out areas of expertise so that we can start to plan for the types of skills that we need to develop, the knowledge that we need to have in order to respond should those changes become real. Scenario planning is something that Herman Miller's been engaged with for almost 20 years. And in the past, it's typically been something that's been very episodic. We typically kind of group things in these 7-year increments where we would pull this consortium together, do a lot of deep thinking, go into this long and rigorous process, and lay out different scenarios that might unfold over the next several years. As we all know, around the increasing rate of change, expectations for speed, planning for those really long-term projects becomes really difficult. Something that we've started to do today within Herman Miller is to look at what we can do in our daily processes to start to incorporate some of those dynamics of futures thinking, scenario planning in our day-to-day actions. So we don't have to go away and do these long-term things. So it moves from something that's episodic to something that becomes more part of the normal course of business. That's one example of how we certainly anticipate work and the supportive work changing over time from something that is kind of monolithic and planned every, say 5 to 10 years, aligned with lease cycles in commercial real estate, to something that happens more on an ongoing basis and is informed by data that we have access to within the environment. So as I talk about the remainder of the information that I want to share with you today, there are a few skill sets that you should keep in mind. And I would encourage you to look into around how you can learn more about. Some of those are scenario planning itself, systems thinking, and qualitative data analysis. Those are all going to be really important in the future. When I said that Herman Miller's been doing scenario planning for almost 20 years, we've learned a lot in that time. We think of our knowledge very much as a system of knowledge that is additive and that we build over time. There's one key aspect of that that we refer to as fundamental human needs. This is very similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those of you that are familiar with that, but it's really targeted towards the actual work context. So those needs being things like purpose, belonging, autonomy, achievement, status, and security. When you look at those 6 and you understand that every decision that we make throughout the course of our work experience is subconsciously influenced by how we anticipate that decision impacting that sense of belonging, that sense of achievement. A good example could be when we were able to walk into a meeting room in our workplace and almost all of the seats around the table are taken except for, say there are 2 or 3 available. You're going to make a decision, most likely, about which seat you choose based on how it's going to impact your sense of belonging with that group, your sense of status with that group. That's an example of how some of those subconscious things start to roll through our mind. So when we look at the current context of working from home, staying connected to our teams, think about some of the things that have already impacted your decision making around, did you send that email? Did you send a different message? Did you send a text or a phone call? Did you make those decisions based on how they were going to impact your connections or your sense of connection to your teammates and your organization at large? That's an example of something that we can do today while we're all working from home. So building from what we know is really important, but we can also look at how we've responded over time. So as Herman Miller's been doing this futures work, scenario planning, when we look back, we've been able to identify 3 macro eras of change, as we refer to them. The era of industry, and this was really from the beginning of the 20th century through much of that time span. Then as we start to get towards the latter decades of the 20th century, we move into what we refer to as the era of information. And then lastly, as we started entering the early 21st century, moving into the era of ideas. I'm going to talk about each of those and then how some of those are starting to transition into what might be yet a new era of change. So when we look at the era of industry, this was really driven by physical mass production and the value that people placed on ideals of order, sequence, mechanization, and hierarchy. When we look at this also, other driving factors were things like limited social networks. Communication technology was relatively limited. Transportation infrastructure wasn't limited. So we've essentially got a situation with the physical production of goods for localized and national markets. As a result, when we look at org structures for organizing the groups of people that are making these things, they were very hierarchical, kind of, command and control type situations where there's one dot at the top. When you think of that kind of classic org structure, there's the one dot, then the row of senior leaders, and then all of these kind of like rank and file dots that fall up underneath. And so you have this very hierarchical org structure. And that relates very much to the thinking of the day and also how work was happening. People were crammed together in these kind of bullpen type offices, a big open room with a lot of individual desks. You can conjure up images of like an old school newsroom with lots of typewriters and phones ringing and kind of a chaotic mess. Well, as we move towards the latter decades of the 20th century and communication technology, transportation infrastructure, all of that expanded, it allowed organizations to expand their reach further into the world. So they started seeking for places where they could get parts for less money, have work done for less pay, all sorts of issues there. That's a topic for a different conversation. But it really started to expand the reach, and that really started to impact the org structure as well. So we went from this neatly contained hierarchical brick to one that was more matrixed, where we had sections of that were replicated over and over and over again. So the structures got exponentially larger. As part of that, the skill set also got larger. So there was a huge demand for white collar work and a way to organize them at much larger numbers. So this is where the panel system was invented to help manage that sheer volume of diversity of task and number of people. Within that period, actually, I want to reference a quote. This is one of my favorites from my career. It comes from this book, The Office, a facility based on change. And this was actually the think piece, the manifesto, if you will, behind the design of Action Office, which was the world's first workstation product. But it was in this era of information was when this was developed. So the section in this book is really looking at the impact of change on an organization. So Bob Probst makes this statement. The total behavior of an organization, its goals, values, people, defines the true growth structure required. Appropriately, this is not just one thing. It is properly as variable as the difference between the structure of a rose and an oak tree. Both are alive, growing, obeying laws of total relative adjustment, but with different end goals. This has been such a powerful statement for me in my own career in terms of thinking about helping organizations to first fundamentally understand what is their unique growth structure. A good example of this could be if a law firm client comes up and says, I work in the legal industry, how many private offices should I have? The response was always, well, that depends. Are you exactly the same as every other law firm under the sun, or do you have something different to offer? And of course, they say they have something different to offer, and then we go down the path of saying, well, how is your structure, how is your culture, your character setting you up to function in a way that's different from another organization or another law firm? So in the era of information, we really started to get this idea that there are these kind of unique and inherent structures that allow an organization to function. From there, we started to move into the era of ideas. As communication technology continued to advance, social networks got larger and larger, and the process of work became more complex. And the value of work shifted from being inherently tied to physical objects to something that was more tied to ideas. So as we moved into that, those kind of matrixed, really rigid org structures started to become more organic, and they started to be these kind of network and node type nebulous cloud type diagrams that organized a community or a company of workers. Within that, we also started to see a large diversification of the different types of skills. And as a result of that, the support for those skills started to vary. So we started to see much more variety coming into the workplace, different types of environments that could be paired with different types of tasks. So that notion of purposeful variety is something that we would inherently tie to the era of ideas. So where does that get us today? Now we're in the situation where we understand that work is very complex and increasingly so, requiring lots of different skill sets. Each of those skill sets have a different range of support, so a different type of variety within the actual workplace and the tools that they're used. But now the difference is that we have to be much more agile in the way that we find the support that we need for our work. People will always need to come together. That's where real creativity and innovation comes from. But now we're in a situation where it's not safe for us to do so. So how can we maintain those bonds now? These are the questions that we need to answer. And then, moreover, once we've answered those questions around how to solve those needs for creativity in the current context, how can we be very quick to switch between an external environment that is safe versus one that is unsafe? There's a lot of work to be done now around how we can return to the workplace and do it safely. And the smartest among us who go about making those plans will look back to what's that unique structure of your organization? What is most critical to achieve? And what does support look like for those? And start to build a more nuanced response. Because of the global pandemic, this novel coronavirus, and it is called novel for a reason, and that's just because there's a lot that we don't know about it. And we're implementing these draconian social distancing measures because that's our last resort. But when you apply monolithic solutions, you get bad results. Just think of the agriculture industry and what happens when you plant one crop over a vast area and the detrimental impact that that has on biodiversity. Same thing is happening to our society right now. So we need to learn more about the intricacies of organizational functioning so that certain functions can be returning to work incrementally over time. So there are some resources that you can dive into to learn more about some of these skills that are going to be necessary in the future, as well as how to think more like a futurist yourself. These aren't necessarily endorsements. These are just my personal beliefs and things that I've thought were interesting. So you can find resources at Institute for the Future, IFTF. They have a lot of great resources online. Coursera is a wonderful online learning platform. And we've also taken a few classes from eCornell around systems thinking in particular. So spend some time thinking about how you work best, how you could work best in the future, and then learn some new skills around systems thinking, scenario planning, qualitative data analysis is another one that's really great as well. So as we spend this time while we're sequestered at home, we can learn a lot more so that when we come back together, we can create a situation that is better than the one that we had when we entered this just a short time ago. Thanks for listening to some of that. I hope it was helpful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.